The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
It's humbling to realize what you think you have picked up the first 6 times you read something, and then in the 7th, you find something new, and the 8th, you find something new, and then someone else reads it and they find, I didn't realize how long it took to hear, how much work it took to really hear. And I don't mean just word for word or phrase for phrase, but what is someone really doing when they're telling a story? And I feel like it's more like getting to know a friend than just learning the cerebral part of the text, really getting to know the heart of an author.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Edmund Spenser's epic poem, The Faerie Queene, is one of the monumental works of English literature, but it just doesn't get read anymore. Rather than curse the darkness, my friend Rebecca Reynolds is lighting a candle. She has rendered Spenser's 36,000 lines of very difficult poetry into much more accessible prose. And artist Justin Gerard has painted absolutely gorgeous illustrations. The books start coming out later this year, but you can get involved now by contributing to the Kickstarter campaign, which is linked in the episode description. Rebecca Reynolds, so glad to have you on the Habit Podcast today.
Thank you, Jonathan. This is going to be fun.
And I'm so excited about your new rendering of the Faerie Queene, prose rendering of a poem. We'll have to spend some time unpacking that.
That's a good one to unpack,
because there are some how questions and there are some why questions related to turning a poem into. How many lines is that poem? 30,000?
About 36,000.
36,000 lines of poetry rendered into prose. Well, yeah. And we call you the Faerie Queene now? Is that your title now?
I would kind of prefer the Great Gloriana.
That's good. Okay, we can work with that. Tell me how this thing came into being. It's continuing to come into being, right?
Right. Yeah. We're still doing some editing, but and then we'll do the book layouts and all of that fun stuff. But it was born in a classroom. I was teaching Elizabethan lit section to 9th graders, and the Faerie Queene, just the very first canto of book 1, was listed in the curriculum as a study in Elizabethan language. Like that was the whole point of that, which is kind of silly because Spenser is not really a good example, as you know, of Elizabethan language. He borrows a lot. He loved Chaucer. He borrows a lot of his diction never really existed. I mean, he just kind of made it up. So it was
like taking Tolkien as an example of mid 20th century.
Exactly. Exactly. Good. And the kids, of course, were bored to tears, except for a couple of super nerds, which I love. But most of them were just in a coma from boredom. And I just thought, this does not do this beautiful work of literature justice. So I went home and spent a lot of that night just reworking it in a form that they could understand, and showed up the next day and read it to them, and they were transfixed. They wanted more of monsters exploding themselves and enchanted forests, and they just were like, why haven't we heard of this before? And so that's where it all began.
Tell me about monsters exploding on themselves.
It's messy business.
Yeah, I guess so. No, the imagery in this poem is just so outlandish.
It's crazy. Yeah. And that particular scene, the Red Cross Knight beheads a giant monster, and her babies, which, are used to crawling into her mouth to escape, drink her blood as it pours out onto the ground of the cave, and they don't stop drinking, and then they explode themselves. So, and it's pretty.
And there's 36,000 lines of this stuff. I mean, that's probably in the upper half of how wild it gets, but it's not especially singular as far as the poem goes.
His imagination is astounding.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because in his letter to Sir Walter Raleigh, he kind of describes what he intends to do with the Faerie Queene. And C.S. Lewis, it's interesting reading what he says about it, because you can tell the story gets away from Spenser. He's attempting to write this tale of moral instruction to create gentlemen, and, he's going to do this noble thing. And then I think somewhere right after book 2 is where he really just kind of cuts loose. And, I know that there's some influence from Ariosto, but there's also just some coming into his own voice, I think, that happens in book 3. And it's just, you find yourself falling into a journey with him. Yeah. So it's incredible.
Yeah. When you first told me years ago that you were going to be doing this, I had my doubts.
Yeah. Jonathan, I'm hurt. You doubted me?
You knew I had doubts talking about that.
Were they big doubts or little doubts?
They were they were fundamental doubts. Whether they were big or little, they were. I mean, just turning this into prose hurt my feelings. Right? The thought of taking this big poem and turning it into prose hurt my feelings.
Yeah, it kind of hurts my feelings too, honestly.
Yeah. So, can you talk to me about the calculation by which you said, I know this is wrong, but I'm going to do it anyway.
So many times in my life, I have gone through that exact same process. This is wrong, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I was pretty comfortable with that progression.
You had so much experience in it.
Yeah. I was an expert in doing things that I knew were wrong. Yeah, it can't be done. And I didn't do it. I mean, that's the bottom line. You can't take poetry and turn it into prose. And so at the same time, nobody's reading the poetry. And I could sit on a throne and scorn them for not reading it, and shame on you for not, hacking your way through this old poem that's harder to read than Shakespeare and harder to read than Marlowe, I think, by far. I mean, students who were soaring through Shakespeare were not able to get through Spenser. Or as a teacher, I can provide a tool. And so my goal isn't to replace Spenser's poem. I decided somewhere in through there to give a great deal of help at the beginning of book 1, and then just slowly integrate more of Spenser's language, so that by the time you finish the last 2 cantos of the fragment of book 7, then you're ready. Then you're not as intimidated to tackle this very difficult poem. So in terms of methodology, how I did it, some places I feel like were more difficult than others. In some places, the poetic structure was, you feel like you're breaking something deep and universal to take that apart because you can't do it. In other places, he seems to use his form in a just a more flat narrative way.
Yes.
So, and there were times when it was just easier to figure out how to do that than others. As I grew toward the end of the poem, it became easier because I felt more comfortable leaving in words that might have been difficult for people in book one. So
yeah. Well, I can tell you how I got more comfortable with the idea. And it was when I began to understand, as you said, when the verse is gone, you lose the verse. I mean, you lose something. And the verse is so incredibly important to that poem.
Right.
But the more I thought about it, the more I read what you were doing, the more I realized I do miss the verse, but that's not all the goodie that's in this poem. Like this imagery is outlandish, and some of the situations and stories are. I mean, when you take away the verse, what you have left is still something along the lines of Tolkien or it's this outsized fantasy story with the monsters and the dragons and all that kind of stuff.
Some things are worth doing imperfectly, I think.
Yeah.
His rhyme scheme, if you think about it, it's, A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C, C. That's a lot of the same endings. And, so to accomplish this, you have to flip a lot of your natural sentence form to make it work. And so to ask someone not only to read something from the 1590s, but something that has a lot of language that's older than the 1590s, and yet the sentences don't even go in the natural order, that's just a lot. And I think that, it's going to be scary. I've had a lot of people look through this and check through it line by line. I'm sure that I have missed things that I will regret. But my publisher has been wonderful about saying that as people write in and let me know what those things are, that we can improve it, and it'll be growing over time. And that makes me feel better about it too. Yeah. I had one person came up to me and said, "Don't take out the daring do. You cannot take the daring do out of Spencer." So every time I ran into daring do, I was.
You just mean the word daring do?
Yeah. It was, well, this person had thought Spencer had created that, but then I was doing some more research and found out that's not quite true, but it is a signature. You think of the daring do being part of Spencer. So there are things like that I just left in for fun. So
yeah. Now a lot of this is because Justin Gerard illustrated the book, but or maybe I should say is illustrating. I guess he's done. He's done. Okay.
Except, well, there's one image I want him to do. I think we don't have a color image yet for the Fragment of Seven, which is one of my favorite bits of the Faerie Queene, those last two cantos that were found after he died. And I just think he'll do a phenomenal job with that. But other than that, he's finished.
Okay. Well, to finish my sentence.
Sorry.
Justin Gerard does such a great job of reminding us that this is the progenitor of so much of the fantasy literature, the whole fantasy genre.
Yeah.
And I think your work makes it very apparent. And then your work plus Justin's work, this is amazing. It's like a Molly Hatchet album.
He was wonderful to work with and I knew from the beginning that Justin was the person to do this. He has so much respect for story, and so little ego to be as gifted as he is, that he was willing to sit under story and yet take liberties when they needed to be taken, Can
you give a concrete example of what you mean by that?
Well, I spent a lot of time either reading the text, recording it for him, because his preference was to listen to the story as he was creating.
Yeah.
And so, you can tell just from that it's somebody who's willing to spend that many hours just listening. And then he would send a sketch, like the sketch of despair originally was one way. And then there were several things like that. And then we would get the text back out and talk through the text. And, you could see the lights go on, and he would, and then there were other things just that he brought such power, like the sea monsters in book 2. You've seen that illustration probably, but just intuitively, he put what's in the text, even though it wasn't in the text, it was like it fit. It was harmonious with what Spencer was doing. So,
well, it's such a beautiful book.
Gorgeous. I'm so thankful for him.
Yeah. We kind of jumped right in and didn't even talk about, this book isn't coming out. It's not out. Tell me about I'm urging you to talk about the Kickstarter campaign, which the day this podcast releases is the first day of the Kickstarter campaign. So tell me about that. Tell me about these things.
Yep. Okay. So we will release November of this coming year. That's the
November
when people
of 23.
Yeah. When you build a Kickstarter campaign, you say, this is when you're going to get your stuff, and you're going to get your stuff in November. So that's the date. Yeah. And what else would you want to know about that?
There's a Kickstarter campaign. I want to make sure all the listeners of this podcast know there's a Kickstarter campaign. Sorry, there's a way for them to help bring this thing into the world.
Right.
And do you have anything to say about, and we, if necessary, we can cut this part out, but do you have anything to say about the decision to do it this way? This is not a conventional way for a publisher to do a new book.
No, I would love to talk about that. I think it's important. When I started doing this work, I was a teacher, and then I was an audiobook reader, and now I'm actually an employee of the company that is publishing this. So I have looked at this project as a writer, and then just sort of a side person, and now I'm inside it. And as I have been looking simultaneously for books to acquire, I've realized some of what I criticize as a writer about the publishing industry. Why are these junk books out there? These are just quick sells. Nobody's going to be reading these in 100 years. And then I realized to fund the things that a publisher might really believe in, there has to be income generated. And so how do you do this in a world in which the big distributor of books, which will go unnamed, is taking vast quantities of the money from authors, from publishers? So how do you level that playing field? And my boss is actually the one who first wanted to do a Kickstarter. He has kind of had his thumb on the pulse of Kickstarter all along, and is an out of the box thinker. And I started to really believe in it. And I thought, this gives us a way to generate projects that are meaningful without the waste. And to find,
tell me, what waste are you talking about?
The noise. There's just so much noise in the book world right now. There's a lot that's, Mark Mennel, a common friend of ours in England, has talked about this bookstore. And has he told you about this? The bookstore that they curate the books to where, say you want a book on Morocco, the only books they have on Morocco there are the best books to read. And I love, not that there can be some book god that determines the best books on Morocco, but the idea of being selective. Yeah. And that's funny you mentioned Mark Mennel and curating, because I was in a bookstore the other day and was about to buy my mother a biography of the Queen. Oh, and I thought, I don't know which of these is so I called Mark Mennel. What did he say? And the one I had in my hand, he said, I wouldn't touch it with a bodge pole. Oh, that's funny. Did he give you the good one? Did he give you a good one?
They didn't have a good one.
Oh, okay.
By Mark's lights. So.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, I'm sorry. I interrupted you.
He would know. Yeah. No, I just think that if the goal is to generate enough income that you are, funding the 3 things that you believe in by publishing the 20 things that people are they're kind of going from their gut and buying to get their adrenaline high or their, dopamine high. Why not cut that out and put things only in the world that are good for the world, and that, kind of, it just cuts through a lot of the chaos, I think. And
Mhm.
who knows, it may not work, but I believe in it now, whereas
Yeah.
at the beginning I was very skeptical.
Well, I mean, the comparison to the patronage system in Spencer's day seems obvious here, right?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
patrons weren't funding. The patrons didn't have to fund a bunch of junk so that Spencer could write what he wrote.
Right.
They just
Right.
funded Spencer.
Yep. I think he was the only, unless I'm mistaken, I think he was the only poet of his time to actually get a pension from the Queen.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Okay.
it's a good thing he made her look good.
That's right. Yeah. Tell me about what the Queen has to do with Queen Elizabeth I, what she has to do with the Faerie Queen.
Okay, well, so the Faerie Queen, it's difficult for me to talk about the allegory of the Faerie Queen, because if you're thinking of something like a morality play or Pilgrim's Progress, you're kind of thinking more of a one-to-one, where
Right.
it's very clear what the connections are. Spencer used allegory in a completely different way, and almost in an archetypal, subconscious kind of way, where there's meaning, but you could say like the character Una represents truth and the church, but she's also very much Una, who makes mistakes, and she's a person in herself. And so there's kind of a ebb and flow of allegory within a given character. So I want to preface what I say about Elizabeth the first with that. But of course, he's writing this to honor her. He was living in English-occupied Ireland at the time. And when he was writing his first 3 books, he really wanted to go back to court in England and was trying very hard to win favor to go back to court. And you can tell that by the end of the 6th book, he realizes this is not going to happen. I mean, the last of the 6 books just kind of drops off. Boom. Like, I'm sad. Nobody likes me. Boom. So thank goodness for the fragments of Book 7, which C.S. Lewis just says, it would be hard to end anything better than they ended the epic poem. But yeah, Elizabeth, so it kind of changes through the poem, although she has different manifestations. Gloriana, the Queen of Fairyland, Britomart represents her in some ways. There's another kind of huntress, Belphoebe, who also is a manifestation of her. Alma, there's a queen who's kind of moderating a court case. So you see a lot of different iterations of Elizabeth in the books, but it's interesting because by the time you get to book 6, he's moved from the chivalric tale to the pastoral. And so this is the one place where he kind of even apologizes to Elizabeth and says, I'm going to feature this woodland queen, and she's going to get the glory in book 6. So it's C.S. Lewis said this is watching someone slowly become an Irishman as he falls in love with the country of Ireland while writing as an Englishman.
That's great. I love it.
So yeah.
Okay, talk to me about what it's like to spend this much time with one big poem. Now, in many ways, I know it feels like a lot of different poems, but it is one big poem by one person.
Yeah.
When you live this long inside a poem, what happens?
It's humbling to realize what you think you have picked up the first 6 times you read something, and then in the 7th, you find something new, and the 8th, you find something new, and then someone else reads it and they find I didn't realize how long it took to hear, how much work it took to really hear. And I don't mean just word for word or phrase for phrase, but what is someone really doing when they're telling a story? And I feel like it's more like getting to know a friend than just learning the cerebral part of a text, really getting to know the heart of an author.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also given me a lot of different perspectives on everything from what does biblical interpretation mean, and what does it mean when I'm listening to someone tell their perspective on something that happened? All those things, it's really deepened my perception on all of that.
Yeah. I know as much as you love Spencer, there are things you don't love about Spencer.
Yeah.
As you got deeper into the project, sometimes you didn't love him as much as you did at other times. Tell me about that.
Well, it's I don't want to make excuses for him. One of the things I don't like is when people look back in time and they say, well, this person was just living in a different era. There are some deep universal principles of ethics that people should just know. You don't keep people captive. You respect all humans. And he made some grave mistakes while working with Lord Grey in Ireland. And he wrote a terrible thing about the Irish. As I was just horrified at first when I was reading about this. And then I dug deeper and realized that, part of the reason that he felt the way he felt about how to, quote, tame a country was because of what England had gone through in the Wars of the Roses and the brutality of those, and how the heavy hand of the Tudors coming in kind of helped him. His perspective was, this is how we came out of brutality. And therefore, as we enter Ireland had so many different factions, and there was so much of what he thought was chaos in religions and how the areas worked. Still, nonetheless, and there was some aggression on the part of the Irish, of course. These people are coming into their country, but it doesn't excuse it. But it does help me understand, I guess, book 5 in C.S. Lewis, as much as he loved the Faerie Queene and borrowed from the Faerie Queene as much as you can find of Narnia and the Faerie Queene, and I feel like Till We Have Faces in some places, C.S. Lewis hated book 5. And that's the book on justice. And it's just Artegall is the main knight, and he has an Iron Man who's like this it's a robotic figure. Do you remember? Talus, and he was given to Artegall to kind of administer all of the severe punishments, and he's just a slaughtering machine. He'll just, he would kind of go in and do the dirty work, and it's very difficult to read book 5 and not feel completely offended. But yet, what an important book for us to read right now, because every country tends to think this is justifiable because these are the ends that I'm going for. So I feel like some of the books I can read and learn from as the way Spencer meant. Book 5, I read it and feel deeply convicted about things that I have believed, and how easy it is, even when you think you're creating something that will help create goodness, to really be off. So, and yet there's stuff in book 5 about how justice works and the different aspects of justice that are interesting as well. So it's difficult for me to answer, and also some of how he treated women, and some of how he speaks about people in other cultures, that bothers me. Thankfully, I was able to put in footnotes quite a bit that said, whoa, not okay, not okay. And I appreciated being a female, especially going through this text and being able to say, it's not your fault if you are attacked, and your goodness the heavens don't always look down on a woman who is being mistreated, and because of her goodness, rescue her. Sometimes she ends up being hurt. And those kinds of things that used to be said could be very hurtful to women who have been through trauma. So I think it's important to talk about those too, because some of those, even if we don't still teach those things, the impressions those teachings have left in our society are there as ghosts. And I think it's good to see where they came from, and that way we can address them head on.
Tell me some stories. You're such a good storyteller. Just tell me some stories that people may not know from the Faerie Queene that are just sort of rip-roaring good stories. You've already described the monsters, the little baby dragons who eat themselves till they burst. Give me some more good stuff like that.
Well, that story is sort of a preview story at the beginning of a lot of the books. Spencer will have a little mini sort of a preliminary story that's going to foreshadow the book as a whole. So that sits in a kind of a separate context along with several of the other. Gosh, it's hard for me to pick. I love Britomart. How could I not love Britomart? I thought I loved Éowyn, and I still love Éowyn, but Britomart is just, man.
Tell me who Britomart is.
Okay, so Britomart is the female knight of book 3. And she begins her tale as a princess. She wanders into a closet or a room back in her father's kingdom and finds the seeing glass thing. Some people actually think was the ball, and some others think it was like a glass. But there's a ball in a museum, a glass ball, that some people think actually was being referenced there. And she looks in it and sees this man. And love for him quickens, and she begins to just waste away. And part of the reason I like book 3 is, and I love Jesus. I love, Orthodox theology. So I don't mean this in a heretical way, but book 1 has very Orthodox, tidy, he's dealing with holiness, and it's beautiful. Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful story of Christian redemption. Book 2 is more Aristotelian ethics, and the focus on the mean, the between two extremes. But in book 3, she doesn't just pray to Jesus, if you want me to marry this man, I'll find him. No, like, it's not like that. Her nurse worries about her because she's wasting away, and tries to do these things, spinning her around and all these like spell kind of things to rid her of love. And of course it doesn't work. And so they go to Merlin, and she finds a foreshadowing of her destiny to be the mother of a great nation. And so she takes on armor. There's a famous female knight. It talks about several famous female knights. She takes on armor, and her nurse takes on armor, and they sally forth to find this man. And so the whole time, the first time I was reading book 3, I thought, here we go. I was ready for the end where she finds her man. And nope. I mean, that, it does not end the way you think it's going to end. But meanwhile, she accomplishes a tremendous amount, faces down things that men can't do, that only she can do. And her interactions with men make me laugh. There's a scene at the beginning where she kind of runs into the main knight of book 2 and Arthur, who's still a prince. They meet each other in the woods. Of course, she knocks one of them off his horse because he challenges her, but they decide to be friends, and they kind of get together. Well, this gorgeous woman, Florimel, as they're, doing their nightly communal stuff, this gorgeous woman starts flying through the wood. And she's breathtakingly beautiful. The men just whoop, she's being chased. Both the men disappear, and Britomart is left alone. She waits a little while, and she's like, I guess they're not coming back. And so she goes on her own journey, and she finds the Red Cross Knight and saves him from a dilemma that he's in. But it's not predictable. So much of this is not predictable. And I love that. I was continually surprised by how Spencer resolved some of the tensions that he created.
Tell me about a couple of monsters in the Faerie Queene.
Well, hard to pick my favorite monsters. You know what I'm going to say? I'm going to say despair. Even though I know that what you're going for are the sea monsters and the dragons and the
it's funny, I was going to ask you to talk about despair, but so let's talk about him as a monster.
Okay, the blatant beast. You've got all these crazy creatures, but I think the most horrifying one, I'll get choked up if I talk about it, but the Red Cross Knight's encounter with despair is one of the most moving things I've ever read. He, starts the journey in secondhand armor, which is funny because you first see him and then you realize he's never even fought a battle.
Yeah.
And he's like all of us when we start a walk of faith. I can do this. I'm I've got this, but yet he's young and untested. And so he doesn't even realize he's proud. He thinks he's being brave, but he's naive and he's proud and he's leaning upon his own power, and he fails and he fails and he fails and he fails. And finally, he's captured. Arthur rescues him. He's captured by a giant after a gross moral failure. He's just completely broken. He's not strong enough to do anything because he's been imprisoned and his muscles are weak. And yet he sees someone riding past in fear, and he immediately thinks, after all those failures, his first thought is, I'll go figure this out and I'll go rescue. I'll go save the day. Here I go to save the day. And he encounters despair. And despair has a dialogue that's terrifying. I mean, just why even he not only recounts all of his mistakes, but he basically convinces him that he's doing God a favor and the world a favor if he just would check out. And there's, are you just going to increase your sin if you keep living? You're going to keep doing harm. And he, as he intends to vanquish despair, he ends up at the end of the scene with a knife that he's about to kill himself. And Una, who is trying to rescue Una's kingdom, she rushes in and rescues him. And she takes him at that point to the house of holiness, where he is tended by faith, hope, and love. And that's where he really learns what it means to help others and to be a force of goodness. So it's such a mighty scene.
Yeah.
And
I'm so suspicious of allegory, and yet that allegory, that insofar as it is, I mean, it's pretty straight allegory. Yeah. It's just so compelling. That's one of my favorite moments in the whole book. And granted, I've only read the whole thing once, but I've read book one a few times, and that's just an incredible part. I'm so glad you talked about that.
The emotional honesty, I think of that. And, I think what struck me the first time I read it was I thought I was the only one. I've read all these Christian books about Christian life, and suddenly I'm reading something from the 1590s that basically recounts my own internal dialogue and the accusations that hit us all when we're at our lowest point. And we just think we're just doing more harm here than good. Like, why even keep going? So it's hard for me to call it an allegory, even though it is, because it's just so emotionally honest.
Yeah, right. I think that's a good way to put it. I'm bothered by allegory because it usually just feels like a puzzle to put together. And once you sort of get the decoder ring right, then everything just sort of falls into place. And that's right. As you said, there's a psychological reality and emotional reality here that's incredible.
Yeah, I had some of my test readers get to that point and really be bothered. Should we take this out? But it resolves. So I ended up putting a footnote in there. Keep going. Don't stop here, because it's so convincing. You find yourself believing it.
Yeah. Speaking of, I mean, though, there are plenty of moments in this story that don't feel like they're exactly kid friendly, and yet you're doing this for young people. In part, C.S. Lewis, there's a famous C.S. Lewis quote about every child should read the Faerie Queene in a beautifully illustrated volume on a rainy day between the ages of 12 and 16 or something like that. And I think 12 might be a little young. I know kids are exposed to more these days, but what would you say? What age would you put this upon someone? I'm so bad at that kind of thing, knowing what's the right, 12 does seem young for a lot of this. Yeah.
Maybe, and maybe some of this would just go over kids' heads if it's in the poetic form, but they're missing a lot of other stuff too at that point. So I've made it clear what's happening. I would say maybe 15 or 16, I guess. It just depends on the kid, what they've been exposed to. But I think a lot of adults also started reading the Faerie Queene. It's funny when I ask people, like, have you read the Faerie Queene? Yeah, I read it in college. I was like, what'd you think? Oh, well, Yeah. So I think hopefully there'll be some adults too that will just get the chance to enjoy this, because like Lewis says, once you are a resident of fairyland, it's permanent. These stories get in your blood, and you start to see the whole world through them.
Yeah. Was it Lewis who said once the Faerie Queene has gained a reader, it never loses that reader?
Yeah. Yeah. It's like becoming tired of London or of life, I think is what he said. It's right. It's right. I find myself constantly thinking about the world through this lens. So
yeah. So good. All right. So tell me about Calidor.
Okay, Calidor. Calidor is the knight of courtesy. So he is supposed to be this example of ultimate courtly gentility, knows what to say, knows what to do. The interesting thing about book 6 is that Spencer changes the definition of courtesy throughout book 6. He tries on one, then he tries on another, then he tries on another, and tries on another. And there were some books written at the time that the average Elizabethan citizen would have been reading about how to be courteous. So at the beginning, you're set up thinking that this guy's going to be, and he's almost too good, and yet he's oblivious. So he finds this man and this woman in the wood. They're clearly not in the state to be visited by other people. They're very, very intimately engaged. And instead of doing what any one of us would do and just, oh gosh, I'm out of here, pretending that you'd never seen it, trying to escape, he decides to go sit down and have a conversation with the man. And it's so awkward. And so, because he's proving how courteous he is, that he can have these throughout the Faerie Queene, you see these conversation. Conversation is a big part of it. Are you able to have a good noble conversation? So, and this just leads to a series of disasters, of course. But and then he disappears for the entire middle of the book, and another character comes in and overtakes the main storyline. You're like, what happened to this guy? He's the main knight. And then when he does come back in the scene, he completely neglects his duty, which he has been commissioned to take out the blatant beast, which is a creature that sort of symbolized the gossip and the malicious talk that was prevalent in Elizabeth's era. But also it's just kind of how it works, the dangers of the wicked tongue. And it has a lot of different tongues, and it's just a ruthless creature. But along the way, he stumbles into a community of shepherds and falls in love with a pastoral gal, and then he's showing up. He's just so awkward. He's just so awkward to be the knight of courtesy. It's hard for me to know where to stop, but he messes up and messes up and messes up, and it's hilarious. So it's like Don Quixote.
Well, yeah, right. That's a great comparison. Okay, I just got to ask you about Braggadocio too.
Oh, he's so funny. So he also reminds me a little of Quixote, right?
Yeah.
So the knight of book 2 has gone into the forest with his palmer. He has a palmer who is kind of his guide, his aged guide. And he goes in to try to rescue this woman. That's another story. But while he's in the forest, this charlatan who would remind you of, who are the two guys in Huckleberry Finn?
Yeah, the prince and the king and the prince.
Yeah. I can't. It seems like they had those are the only names they had.
No, I'm sorry. The Dauphin. Well, they called him. Try to pronounce the Dolphin, and the king and the Dolphin is who it was.
Okay. So he kind of reminds me of them. He's this massive charlatan, and he takes the horse, and he takes I believe the shield, another in the saddle and all the stuff. And so he believes at that point he's a knight. And he is just puffed up, and has these grand delusions of going to court and thinking, you can see him thinking about how everybody's going to admire him. But he's a total coward, and he runs from everything. He steals. He's a terrible, terrible person who maintains this kind of high comic. You would think of kind of a Shakespearean comic figure. But then in the end, I don't want to wreck it for people, but he ends up winning in some sense. In some sense. I mean, he does, things do happen to him at the very end.
Like, does he get elected to Congress or something like that?
Yeah. Yeah. He finds a bunch of people who are like him, and no, he yeah. I mean, he does have bad things happen at the very end, but for a long time, it just seems to work. It seems to work for him for a long time, and it's very funny.
Yeah.
So it's like a slippery pig you can't really catch.
All right. I'm trying to think of a way to rephrase. I always ask, who are the writers that make you want to write? It feels more appropriate to ask some other question. Oh, well, I mean, are there some Spencer commentators who helped you, who shaped your way of thinking about this poem?
Oh my gosh. Well, of course, Hamilton's an incredible resource. I mean, just A.C. Hamilton's annotated Spencer is so good, and he has a Spencerian dictionary as well. But these are my favorite people to read, and I think Spencerian critics are my favorite critics I've ever encountered. And I love, I'm one of those nerds that likes to just be in the stacks reading literary criticism, but I've never read criticism that's like the Spencerian. And I think it's just because it's such an interesting piece of literature. There's certain types of people who get hooked on it. Mm-hmm. And Lewis's, I'm not sure that I always agree with him and his images of life that was collected by a friend of his. It's a bunch of his lectures, but they're incredible. They're so good, and he has a chapter, I think, in his medieval studies book as well on the Faerie Queene. So of course, read Lewis. Humphrey Tonkin blows my mind. He is an Esperanzist, so
it's so funny.
That language that is like the combo language.
Yeah.
He's just brilliant, and some of his theories on what Spencer was doing as he progressed from book 1 to book 6. He's just a delight to read. He's so, and he wrote me, and I will confess I screamed a little bit because this great thinker responded to me. He's contacted me a couple times, and it's been just wonderful to see his kindness.
He's glad to see that you're doing this?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, he's been very kind about it. If he's not, and then there have been some kind of collection. It seems like Spencer comes in and out of vogue. But in the 70s, it seems like there were, these groups of people, who would come together and have a conference and write things. And they're so, I bet it was so much fun to be in those rooms.
Yeah. I took a seminar on Spencer at Vanderbilt, and it was, there were 3 of us around a little round table plus the professor.
Yeah.
And he was a very old man, probably not as old as I am now, but I thought he was a very old man at the time. And it was just so much fun, and there was so much to disagree about Spencer.
Yeah.
When you read those critics, it's wild how completely opposite people take those stories.
Yeah. I think some of it's because the way he writes, you've got the theology, you've got the politics, you've got but then underneath that, you just had this kind of archetypal, I don't know how to put exactly into words what like Beowulf does. And when you read Beowulf, but it's like the story is doing a work, you're reading it, but also the story is getting in there and you're recognizing things. What is unfirth? I don't know. I feel like Spencer does some of that too. And so it's easy to adopt the stories into ourselves to where we're personalizing them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that's part of the reason some of the passion grows around some of this.
Yeah. All right. I want to make sure people have an easy time finding your Kickstarter, people who want to help make this happen. So how do you do this? You go to Kickstarter and search something? How does it work?
Probably the easiest way would be to go to Faerie Queene, FAERIEQUEENE.com. Or if you forget that, go to Sky Turtle Press.
Okay.
And on like Facebook or Twitter. And it will, you will eventually get to our page. Mm-hmm. And on our page, there's a link to the Kickstarter. So that's probably the easiest way without giving you an extended URL here.
All right. And I'll also include a link on the description of this episode. So
okay, yeah, we've got some fun stuff in the
that?
Campaign. I said we've got some fun stuff in the campaign. I think it's going to be
great.
Some rewards and stuff. It's going to be fun.
Excellent. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much for being here. This has been so much fun. It's always fun to talk to Rebecca.
Thank you for asking me. I appreciate it.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com. And to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.